I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for coming out and being part of Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers in Vermont, Brattleboro. Thank you for being here. My name is Jennifer Decker, and I'm an organizer with Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers in Vermont. And I'm going to say a few words, tell you a little bit about the evening and the order of things. And then I'll be introducing our main speaker, who is Dr. Ira Hefland. And so before I do that, I just want to say, if you haven't gotten a bumper sticker already, it comes with the ice cream. The bumper stickers are free. If you have a place you could take a bumper sticker to, or a few bumper stickers for friends, please feel free to help yourself. We do have more available, even more than are on the table. On the back table, we also have a copy of our resolution, which is the Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers in Vermont resolution that we're working on passing through the state legislature now. Many of you may already be co-sponsors of the resolution if you've signed our petition online, which is at www.canbvt.org. That web address is also on your bumper sticker very conveniently. So please take a look, and please sign that, and please share that with friends as well. We also brought our list of legislators. If you want information about how to contact your legislator, we have a House resolution number now, which is HR 7. So when you're calling, you can let them know that that's what you support. And we also are having it introduced in the Senate, in the Vermont State Senate as well. So please reach out to all your state representatives and senators tomorrow if you can. It's very important for folks to hear from us as soon as possible. So I wanted to let you all know about that. I have a statement that I'm going to read from Colonel Roseanne Greco. Colonel Roseanne Greco served in the Air Force as a colonel for a very long time, and she was in charge of nuclear strategy. And so she knows a lot about it, and she has devoted herself to efforts to stop the basing of the F-35, and it's now coming to light more and more that there's a nuclear capability of the F-35, and more avenues and inroads being made by our current government in terms of possible use of this weapon. And so that's why we're all here tonight. So I will read this statement from Roseanne Greco. The Department of Defense's 2018 Nuclear Posture Review contained a message of enormous significance for Vermonters. It designated the F-35 as a part of its strategic nuclear bomber force. This is the first time a fighter has been so designated. That makes the F-35 completely different from the F-16 or any earlier nuclear-wired fighter. Numerous high-level Defense Department officials have elaborated on the role that the F-35 will play in regional nuclear deterrence. That is, in so-called small nuclear wars. The F-35 will carry what has been called the most dangerous nuclear weapon in America's arsenal, the B-61-12 guided nuclear bomb that is custom-tailored for the F-35. The Pentagon has been developing this new nuclear bomb specifically for the F-35's bomb bay since 2010. The B-61-12 nuclear bomb has settings for 4 different sizes of nuclear blast, referred to as dial-a-yield capability. Because the B-61-12's smallest setting is only 1/3 of a kiloton, military war planners are talking about this as a usable nuclear weapon. And even more dangerous, because the F-35's stealth technology and the accuracy of its B-61-12 bombs, the F-35 is being considered a first-strike nuclear weapon. Not since the worst Cold War crises has the U.S. been as close to a nuclear war as we are now. This is because our current administration is ripping up nuclear arms control treaties, budgeting $1.5 trillion for new nuclear weapons, and most frighteningly, modernizing most of them with smaller, more usable nuclear weapons, while openly stating that these nuclear weapons will give us the option of conducting a first nuclear strike against non-nuclear threats. Moreover, our current president seems not to understand nuclear weapons or the consequences of using them. In fact, he has spoken about wanting to use nuclear weapons. Current F-35 models with their current computer system, including the ones scheduled for Burlington, do not yet have the nuclear capability. Pentagon officials estimate that the F-35 could be armed with the B-6112 nuclear bomb as early as 2020. Once this occurs, all new models of the F-35 will be nuclear capable, and previously produced F-35s, including Vermont's, will be upgraded with the same nuclear capability. Because the military is not required to release information about military capability and missions, it is highly unlikely that Vermonters will be told when our F-35s become nuclear capable. Therefore, Vermonters will likely never know, just as Vermonters were never told the last time the Vermont Air National Guard was assigned a nuclear mission. In the 1960s, the F-89, the fighter model then being flown by the Vermont Air Guard, was upgraded to be nuclear capable. Shortly thereafter, the Vermont Air Guard was assigned a nuclear mission and actually flew from Burlington carrying nuclear weapons. Even though F-16s had nuclear wiring, they were never declared part of our strategic nuclear triad as the F-35 is now. Thus, the F-16 posed no strategic nuclear threat to Russia or China, and Vermont was never a nuclear target. However, the F-35 is now part of our nuclear triad. It will carry a usable nuclear bomb. It's been discussed officially as being a first strike nuclear weapon, and the Vermont Air National Guard is the first operational guard base for the F-35. There are two huge implications for Vermont from these facts. First, the Vermont Air Guard's F-35 will immediately become a huge threat to our enemies, and Vermont will become a nuclear target. It's important to clarify that in nuclear targeting, it is the delivery vehicles and their bases which are targeted, not the warheads. So it's the bombers and the bomb bases which are the targets, not the bombs themselves. And second, in our name, the Vermont Air National Guard could be assigned by the president to drop a nuclear weapon on another country. The F-35 will carry 2 nuclear bombs. Each bomb has a maximum yield of 50 kilotons. The nuclear bomb we dropped on Hiroshima was only 15 kilotons. It killed 146,000 people. About 90,000 died on the first day, and 56,000 people died over the next 4 to 6 months. Because it is a single-seat fighter, the F-35 is a far more dangerous nuclear bomber than our other 2 current strategic bombers, the B-52s and B-2s. They have crews. The F-35 has only 1 human being in control. So 1 F-35 pilot with 1 push of the button could imperil the planet. If Vermont's F-35s are assigned a nuclear mission, then the beginning of a nuclear war could start from Vermont. However, if Vermonters say no to basing nuclear bombers in Vermont, then the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons could start from Vermont. Either of these outcomes may depend on the choices Vermont legislators will make in May. So that concludes the statement from Colonel Roseanne Greco.
Do the legislators have to discuss? Can they make the, do they make the decision?
The legislators are in a position now to vote on the resolution if they allow it to pass out of committee. And at that point, if we have a resolution passed around the state that we show that the citizenry of Vermont rejects the basing of this nuclear capable plane in our state, at that point we will have a vehicle with which to go forward to our congressional delegation and say Vermonters say no.
Do you want to mention the role that the Vermont congressional delegation has taken in this plane being based in Burlington?
We can, I think what I'd like to do, because they have taken a role, is defer questions until the end. We'll have more time for discussion when Dr. Ira Hefland is done with his presentation. Thank you. So Dr. Ira Hefland is here. He's a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. He is the co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the founding partner organization of ICAN, and itself a recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Ira Hefland is the co-founder and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is the U.S. affiliate of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ira Hefland.
Thank you. And again, thank you all for coming out tonight. I mean, this is obviously not a very pleasant thing that we have come to talk about, but it's something we really do need to talk about. My own feeling at this point is we have two choices. We can either talk about nuclear war or we can experience nuclear war, because at the moment we are heading in that direction in a way that those of us, which I think is probably almost everybody in this room, who experienced the end of the Cold War never thought would happen again. In the 1980s, we were all acutely aware of the fact that nuclear weapons were the greatest threat to humanity on the planet, and that we faced an imminent and enormous danger of nuclear conflict. And when the Cold War ended, we all began to assume and to act as though this danger had gone away completely. It never actually did. 14,000 nuclear warheads remain today. There were even more in the immediate post-Cold War period. So the threat never went away. But in the last few years, the danger of nuclear war has increased dramatically, and it continues to increase dramatically. And that requires that we address this issue and that we bring about a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear policy and in the nuclear policy of the other nuclear-armed states. All 9 of the countries which have nuclear weapons base their security on the myth that somehow or other nuclear weapons make them safer and make their people safer. And this is a terribly flawed concept which has led to disastrous decisions on the part of all of these governments, and we need to bring about a total change in the way we look at these weapons. We need to come to understand that far from promoting our security, they are in fact the greatest threat to our security. They are an existential threat to our survival on this planet, and we need to get rid of them once and for all. I was very taken with this excellent statement by Colonel Greco because she highlights the role that people here in Vermont can play, and I think it's a role that other people, grassroots all around the country, can play in promoting this revision, this change of U.S. nuclear policy. This is a decision which will be taken at the national level, but the pressure to bring about that decision is only going to happen if grassroots activists all around the country take action. And here in Vermont, the stationing of the F-35 in Burlington, I think, gives a superb focus for people to organize around to make it clear that they do not want these bombers here, and even more so, to make it clear that they want the whole U.S. nuclear policy to change. I want to talk for a few minutes about why the danger of nuclear war is greater, and then I want to talk a little bit about what nuclear war would be like, because I think it's important for us to remind ourselves about that. And I want to come back to, at the end, to what it is that we can do about it. So first of all, why are we so worried today? The Cold War did end 25 years ago, more than that. The reason I think we're worried is because in the assessment of people like William Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, and also the advisory panel to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, we are closer to nuclear war than we have ever been. Perry has stated explicitly that he thinks the danger is greater than it was in the worst moment of the Cold War. And the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in January of 2017 set their doomsday clock at 2 minutes to midnight, which is the closest they have ever set it to the end of the world. And they reaffirmed that position when they set the clock this year, also at 2 minutes to midnight. If you can't hear me, I'm going to ask you to move up front because I can't make my voice louder, and there are empty chairs here, so please move up, please. I would actually, there are 4 empty seats in the front. If people want to move up, please do. So in my own thinking, I've identified at least 7 factors which I think are contributing to the increased danger of nuclear war. 4 of them relate to specific geopolitical flashpoints, and then there are 3 other factors besides that. The first and greatest reason why we face an increased danger is the decline, the deterioration relationship between the United States and Russia. You know, when the Cold War ended, we believed that this horrible chapter in history was over for good. But relations between the United States and Russia are now worse than they have been at any point in the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War. They have gotten to a point where there are flashpoints where military conflict could break out in Ukraine, in Syria, possibly in the Baltic states. There has been an unbelievable resurgence of nuclear saber rattling on both sides in the last 2 or 3 years. And it is now clear that while we were told for 20 years that we didn't need to worry about US and Russia going to war ever again, we in fact do need to worry about that. There's a real potential for conflict and a real danger that if there is a conflict, that conflict will become a nuclear war. So that's the first factor. Second is the decline in relations between the United States and China. Those relations are the worst they've been in about 40 years. During the last decade of the Cold War, China was essentially an ally of the United States. It was kind of an honorary member of NATO, part of the containment strategy around the Soviet Union. That's not true anymore. We have a very tense relationship with China, much of it driven by economic rivalry, but there is an explicit military dimension to this rivalry as well, which manifests itself in the South China Sea, where US and Chinese naval forces play chicken on a regular basis around the series of islands that are contested by several countries bordering the South China Sea. And this is incredibly dangerous and irresponsible, and it's an incident which could lead to war waiting to happen. That's the second factor. Third is the situation in North Korea, and it's important for us to remind ourselves that just 1 year ago, we had good reason to believe that the United States and North Korea were on a path to nuclear war. That danger was dissipated somewhat by the Singapore summit, but the situation was not, the fundamental problem there was not resolved. And the situation remains extremely dangerous, as we saw with the recent collapse of the Hanoi summit and the recent testing just last week of a new North Korean missile system. This remains an extremely volatile and dangerous situation, and we don't know how it's going to play out. We don't know if the Trump administration will continue to lie that they have had the greatest diplomatic triumph in all of human history, or if they will revert to this fire and fury rhetoric and action that preceded the Singapore summit. So that's the third reason that we need to worry about nuclear war. The fourth geopolitical flashpoint is one which gets almost no attention here in the United States, but which I personally think is the most dangerous of all, and that's the situation in South Asia between India and Pakistan. They have fought 4 wars. They are now, both of them, major nuclear powers with about 130 nuclear warheads each. We have, on a daily basis, fighting between these 2 countries on their border in Kashmir. It's usually low level, a few mortar rounds or a few artillery shells. A few weeks ago, there was a big uptick in the fighting when 40 some odd Indian soldiers were killed in a terrorist attack. The Indians sent planes into Pakistan for the first time in decades. 2 of them were shot down. It was extremely tense. And what we know about the military strategies of both India and Pakistan makes it clear that if events get out of control there, and there is another war between India and Pakistan, this will be a nuclear war. And we need to understand that a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, as I will come back to in a few minutes, will not just be a catastrophe in South Asia. It will be a disaster for us living here in New England as well. So those are the 4 geopolitical flashpoints. And sort of underlying all of these potential areas of conflict are the plans in progress of all of these countries, and indeed all 9 nuclear weapon states, to modernize their arsenals, to make them more fit for fighting. The United States is talking a great deal about creating more usable nuclear weapons, and the F-35 is a major part of that effort. And this attempt to blur the line, this carefully constructed firewall against using nuclear weapons that has existed since Nagasaki, this effort to blur that, to breach that firewall, to make nuclear weapons more usable, is extraordinarily dangerous, and it underlies the planning of most of the nuclear weapon states, certainly the United States, Russia, China, India, and Pakistan. 4 geographical flashpoints, 3 other factors we need to worry about. 1, climate change. People don't often associate climate change and the nuclear problem, but we need to. We have been told for decades by the US government and by the other nuclear armed states that they plan to get rid of the nuclear weapons someday, when the world is safer, when they don't need them anymore. The problem is that the world is not getting safer. It is getting far more dangerous, and it is climate change which is driving us in that direction. And over the coming decades, even if we do everything that we're supposed to do to try to curtail climate change, it will continue to some degree. And large parts of this planet will find it increasingly difficult to support the human populations which live there now, let alone the projected increases in human population that we expect to see in the coming decades. As the waters of the Indus between India and Pakistan dry up, the potential for conflict there will be greater. As the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates dry up in the Middle East, the potential for conflict there will be greater. As the waters of the Nile dry up, potential for conflict in Africa will be much greater. There will be forced migrations on a scale unimaginable. Tens of millions of people will be displaced. And if nuclear weapons are on the table, as all of this conflict and turmoil plays out, the chance they will be used will continue to grow. So that's the 5th factor. 6th is cyber terrorism. We used to think that the worst thing we had to worry about with regards to nuclear weapons and terrorists was that a terrorist group would get hold of probably a single nuclear bomb, probably a small one about the size of the Hiroshima bomb, and would use it to attack a major city like Washington or New York or Moscow or Tel Aviv or Bombay. What we now understand is that that is a real danger, and we need to be concerned about that. But an even greater danger is the possibility that a terrorist group could carry out a cyber attack and hack into the command and control systems of one of the nuclear armed states and either directly cause the launch of that country's weapons, or perhaps more likely create a false alert and induce the country that is being hacked into launching its own nuclear weapons in the mistaken belief that it's under attack by one of its enemies. This is an absolute nightmare. The United States spends a large amount of money every year on cybersecurity, and the cybersecurity experts are quite explicit about the fact that the offense, those who would launch a cyber attack, always have the upper hand over those who are trying to figure out what that attack might look like and plan to defend against it before it occurs. So as long as we have nuclear weapons, and especially as long as they are sitting on missiles that can be launched in a matter of minutes and that are hooked up to computer systems, the possibility of a cyber attack-induced nuclear war is a real and growing threat. And finally, right at the moment, we need to consider one other factor, and I'm always a little bit hesitant about talking about this because I think that this should be a nonpartisan issue. The fact that Republicans and Democrats cannot come together and see the need to get rid of nuclear weapons is really quite striking, and it's a product of our own time. In the 1980s, the Freeze movement had broad bipartisan support among the general population and in Congress. But today things are different and we're much more polarized. So when we talk about the Trump factor, which is the 7th great risk that we are dealing with, there's a danger that people will see this as a partisan critique and that they will sort of, therefore, rally around the president, those who support him. I think it's important to emphasize what the problem here is. The United States has said for decades that it would be impermissible for even a single nuclear warhead to get into the wrong hands, by which they meant a terrorist group or a rogue state. We have now a President of the United States who, I believe, has the wrong hands. And this is not my opinion or the opinion of the peace community. This is the opinion of the security experts in his own party. During the 2016 election, I think it was 80 some odd Republican defense experts famously signed a statement saying that Donald Trump lacked the judgment, the temperament, and the knowledge base to command a nuclear arsenal. After he became president, his first Secretary of State referred to him as a moron in the specific context of his views about nuclear weapons. And his first Secretary of Defense called him an idiot in the same context. This is a shocking situation with a man with this lacking in judgment, in sound temperament, and in knowledge about nuclear weapons is in charge of an arsenal of 6,800 warheads. And we own it. We in the United States. We elected this guy. And until he leaves office, we will live with the heightened danger of nuclear war. So for all of these reasons, it is appropriate that we have gathered here today and are concerned about what we can do to prevent this from happening. I want to talk a little bit about what happens if we fail, because I think it's important for us to remind ourselves of how great the stakes are here. We all know at some level that nuclear weapons are very bad, but I think we tend to dismiss what would happen. We call it the end of the world. That's not really a description of what nuclear war will look like. It's a throwaway phrase that we use to stop thinking about what's actually going to happen. And we need to think about what's going to happen. So I want to talk a little bit about limited nuclear war, because this is something which is a new understanding over the last 10 years. And then I want to talk about large-scale nuclear war. Back in the 80s, we used to think that it was only a large war between the United States and the Soviet Union that would put the entire planet in peril. What we have learned in the last decade is that even a very limited nuclear war, one involving perhaps India and Pakistan, would be a global catastrophe. The specific scenario that's been studied repeatedly looks at what happens if India and Pakistan use 50 small Hiroshima-sized bombs against each other, targeting urban industrial targets. And the data is really quite terrifying. The immediate consequences in South Asia, 20 million people dead in the first week, from the explosions, from the fires, from the radiation. But even more significant is what happens worldwide because of climate disruption. 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs going off over cities produces an enormous amount of soot, about 5.5 million tons, which is lofted into the upper atmosphere. And with a matter of days, it circulates so that it covers the entire planet, blocking out the sun, dropping temperatures, and causing several other forms of climate disruption, as a result of which there's a catastrophic decline in food production. The temperatures drop about 1.5 degrees centigrade. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. And the decline in food production triggers a worldwide famine, which we have estimated would put up to 2 billion, with a B, 2 billion people at risk of starvation. Now, when this study came out in 2006, originally, it was roundly criticized as being a worst case scenario. They don't have that many weapons, they would never use that many weapons, and so on. It's true the scenario was not realistic. It assumed 50 warheads on each side. We now understand that they have 130 warheads on each side. And it assumed that the warheads were Hiroshima-sized. We now know that many of the weapons in the Indian and Pakistani arsenals are 3 to 5 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And so a new study is being done this year looking at what would actually happen today between India and Pakistan if they used their actual arsenals against each other. Much of the data has not been finalized and submitted for publication yet, but a few details are clear. One is that this war would not kill 20 million people in South Asia in the first week. It would kill 80 million people, which is more than died in all of World War II. And second thing is that the soot generated from this war would be far greater, and it would not drop temperatures across the planet 1.5 degrees centigrade. It would drop them 4 degrees centigrade. The implications of that for agriculture have not been studied yet, but they're obviously not good. And so the bottom line is that a very limited nuclear war involving like 0.5% of the world's nuclear arsenals and taking place far away from us in one very localized geographic area, that nuclear war would have catastrophic global consequences. The death of 2 billion people, were that to happen, would not be the extinction of our species, but it would be the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there's absolutely no reason to think that the very complex, fragile economic system that we all depend on to put food on our tables, to provide heating in the winter, to clothe us, to take care of all of our material needs, there is no reason to believe that that civilization would survive a shock of this magnitude. That's a limited nuclear war. A large-scale nuclear war between the United States and Russia would be far worse, and we do need to contemplate what that would look like because it is clear that that is now, again, a possibility. I want to start by describing what a large-scale attack on a city would look like with modern nuclear weapons. There's an image up here, a couple of images from Hiroshima, I believe. Actually, it's from Nagasaki on the top, I think. We all have images in our head of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the destruction that took place at those cities is a very powerful warning of what nuclear weapons can do. But the most important thing we need to know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for the enormity of the destruction that would take place with a modern nuclear war. A city like New York would not be hit with one 15-kiloton bomb. It would be hit with 15 or 20 or more nuclear warheads, each of which would be 30 to 50 times more powerful. I use a model to describe what the effect of an attack of that magnitude would be like. It assumes one very large explosion in the center of the city. It actually causes less damage than would be caused by 15 or 20 bombs spread out over the whole metropolitan area. But I think it gives an adequate appreciation of the level of destruction that we're going to be thinking about. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of that explosion, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within that entire area, the temperatures would rise to 20 million degrees, which is hotter than the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the winds would be greater than 600 miles per hour, and the blast pressure greater than 25 pounds per square inch. Mechanical forces of that magnitude can destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, gasoline, heating oil, wood, plastic, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, we're talking about 12 to 15 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this were indeed part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction would occur in every major city in both countries, including Burlington. And if Canada and NATO, the rest of NATO, were dragged into the conflict, most of the great cities in Canada and in Europe would also be destroyed in this way. All told, perhaps 300 million people dead in an afternoon. But again, this is only part of the story. A limited war in South Asia puts about 5.5 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere. A war between the United States and Russia would put 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere. And that would drop temperatures on this planet not 1.5 degrees centigrade, but an average of 8 degrees centigrade. In the interior regions of North America, like here, in the interior regions of Eurasia, the temperatures would drop 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. That's like 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We have not seen conditions on this planet that cold in 18,000 years, since the coldest moment of the last ice age. We would essentially create a new man-made ice age in a matter of days. For 3 years, here in the Northern Hemisphere, there would not be a single day free of frost. For some portion of every single day, the temperature would go below freezing. And under those conditions, all of the ecosystems which have evolved in the current temperate period of the last 12,000 years, they would all collapse. Food production across the planet would stop. The vast majority of the human race would starve to death. And under these conditions, it is possible we would become extinct as a species. Now, this is not some horrible fantasy designed to be the plot of a movie. This is the danger we are facing every day that we continue to maintain 14,000 nuclear warheads in the world. And even if none of the nuclear armed states make a conscious decision to go to war, there is always the danger that there will be an accident. We know of at least 7 occasions when either Moscow or Washington began the process of launching their nuclear arsenals in the mistaken belief that they were under attack by the other side. And on each of these occasions, we were not saved because we had wise leaders, or because we had sound policies, or because we had good technical systems. We were saved because we were unbelievably lucky. As Robert McNamara said famously after Cuba, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And I would argue that the current policy of the United States, including its decision to station nuclear-armed fighter jets in Burlington, is nothing more than a hope for continued good luck, which is a fairly insane basis for national security policy. We need to change that policy fundamentally. And registering a strong, unequivocal opposition to the stationing of these bombers in Burlington is a very important step in that process. A resolution passed by the state legislature, a strong campaign by the congressional delegation would send a very powerful signal and help to build the momentum which is growing across the country for a change in this insane nuclear policy. Nationally, many groups have come together in a campaign called Back from the Brink, which calls for the United States to embrace the recently passed Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and fundamentally change its nuclear policy to accept that nuclear weapons are the greatest threat to our national security and to actively seek their elimination by entering into negotiations with the other 8 nuclear-armed states for an enforceable, verifiable, time-bound agreement to dismantle the weapons that remain. The Back from the Brink campaign also calls on the United States to take 4 interim steps while these negotiations are in progress to lessen the danger of nuclear war. It calls the United States to promise it will never use nuclear weapons first, to end the unchecked authority of the President of the United States, any president, to launch nuclear war on his or her own authority, to take our weapons off hair trigger alert, get them off of missiles that can be launched in 15 minutes' time, and to end this plan to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years modernizing and increasing the capabilities of every single aspect of our nuclear arsenal. And of course, the F-35 is a central portion of that plan to make our weapons more usable. This campaign nationally is being run by my organization, Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the United Church of Christ, many other faith groups, the Hip Hop Caucus, Indivisible, 350.org, the environmental group, and many other national organizations that understand that we must bring about a fundamental change in nuclear policy. And the campaign here in Vermont, I think, plays directly into this movement and will help to build tremendous pressure, not least because one of your senators is a major candidate for president, and therefore to influence his thinking is enormously important, but also because a statement by an entire state that we do not want nuclear warheads based in our state will reverberate across the country and will have a huge impact. And so I think that it is really wonderful that you've come out tonight. We need to figure out how we mobilize the rest of the state legislature to support this resolution. And I would encourage you also to look for ways that you can participate in the broader national campaign, which has its own campaign website, www.preventnuclearwar.org, and a national piece of legislation in the U.S. Congress, House Resolution H-Res 302, which embodies the entire 5-point platform of the Back from the Brink campaign. When we talk about these issues, it's easy to get kind of overwhelmed. This is a gigantic problem. It is a terrifying threat, and it is a very real threat. And each of us faced with this, I think, feels very small and all alone. And what can we do about this? I think it is important for us to understand that we can do a very great deal. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became President of the United States as the most hawkish leader we have ever had with regards to nuclear weapons. He wanted to build an arsenal to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. He thought that could be done, and he wanted to be able to do it. And he did build that arsenal. We deployed Pershing missiles in Germany that could take out Moscow with only 6 minutes warning. It was a terrifying time. And in 1984, just 3 years after he took office, Ronald Reagan said something which was quite extraordinary. He said that nuclear war could never be won and must never be fought. It was like a 180-degree reversal of the policies that he had espoused when he became president. And it came so abruptly that the millions of us who had been, and there was a huge movement at that time, the millions of us who had been working to change U.S. nuclear policy kind of missed it. We thought this was just campaign rhetoric, but it wasn't. We had actually brought about a fundamental change in the thinking of the U.S. administration, and efforts in the Soviet Union had brought about a fundamental change in Soviet views towards nuclear weapons as well. And in a totally remarkable turn of events, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was really leading this process, and Ronald Reagan, who became his partner, ended the Cold War arms race. They stopped building new nuclear weapons as we had asked them to, and they began the process of negotiating how to dismantle the weapons that were present. They talked very seriously about getting rid of all nuclear weapons, although they were never able to bring that about. And so we have seen how political activity by ordinary citizens, which is what drove the process in the 1980s, can create a profound change in policy in a very short period of time. And when we talk about bringing about an end to the nuclear weapons era, about eliminating all of these weapons, we are only asking ourselves to do again what we have already done once. No one of us is expected to do this all by himself or herself, but each one of us is expected to do that part of the job which is ours to do. And I think if we all do that, if we all come together and work on this issue, we can have the same kind of impact that people had back in the 1980s, and we can do something really important. We can save the world. When I talk to young people, I'm particularly concerned, like a student audience, because they had nothing to do with creating this problem, and I feel really kind of guilty about dumping all this on them. And I do explain, once you have heard this information, there is a terrible burden on your shoulders. If you know about this, you can't ignore it. You have to take action. And that's really a very great responsibility. But I also try to encourage them to view it as in some ways a very great opportunity, a gift of sorts. Every one of us wants to do something good with our life. Those of us living today have been given the opportunity to save the world. And there's absolutely nothing better that anyone can ever do with his or her life. And so in that spirit, I would urge you to take up this campaign and to make Vermont a leader in the national movement to bring about a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear policy. In this week right after the big Christian and Jewish holidays, perhaps I can be forgiven for a little biblical quote, which I like to use. In Deuteronomy, it's reported that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore choose life, that you and your children might live." That is literally the choice before all of us today. And we have to choose wisely. And we have to act with courage and with determination. And if we do, our children will live. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions about what I talked about, and then Jennifer, you should come back and we should talk about the campaign. Yep.
Are you from Vermont?
Excuse me?
Are you from Vermont or New?
I'm from Western Mass. I live in Northampton, Mass.
All right.
Yep.
So maybe Jennifer can speak to this better. I'm interested in hearing about the politics of supporting the F-35s being based at the Burlington airport prior to the information about them being nuclear capable, and whether the mayor of Burlington supported the basing, whether Leahy, Sanders, and Welsh supported the basing, and sort of the interesting politics of trying to turn around recent support for this basing based on the new information that nuclear weapons could be based in Vermont, say, instead of Plattsburgh or somewhere else.
I mean, I think that I will defer to Jennifer in a second for some of the details about this, but I think the critical point is that making these weapons, these bombers, nuclear capable changes everything. And it gives anyone who supported their basing before a very simple reason for changing his or her mind. This changes everything. Do you want to talk about some of the specifics of?
I agree with what you're saying. I feel that there have been previous efforts, and we are built on the foundation of those previous efforts. I think that the situation, the equation has changed, and like Dr. Hefland is saying, that it does give an out to any politician who has supported this in the past to say, well, like, let's hold up, let's slow things down. So Representative McCullough, who was one of the original co-sponsors of the bill in the House, wrote a wonderful letter to the editor basically along those lines, saying prior to having this information, he was a supporter of the basing, and now that people know that they're being made nuclear capable and all these different layers are in place that increases the danger to us, it's an entirely different equation.
What I'm about to say may be subject to correction as far as accuracy, but to the best of my knowledge, every bit of violence, killing out on the mountain and in the fields and in the river, in the natural world, has a purpose and has a limit, and it's there to maintain the whole ecosystem of the world, the natural world. The only animal on the planet that kills for the sake of killing is the human. And I'm confused. I don't understand what it is, why that difference is there.
I'm not sure why it is either. But I think that the point is this. We're also the only animal that can sort of sit back and reflect on what we're doing and make a deliberate decision to do something different. There's been a terrible amount of violence throughout human history. Nuclear weapons have changed all that too, because the violence which we contemplate today is not limited, it's universal. A large-scale nuclear war will be the end of our civilization, and I think we need to understand that. And I think we are capable of understanding that, and we're capable of taking action based on that understanding. So whatever our unfortunate proclivities towards violence may be, we are not, generally speaking, suicidal. And when we come to understand that nuclear war is an act of suicide, these are suicide bombs that we have developed and deployed and proposed perhaps to use. When we understand that, I think we can make the correct decision that we need to get rid of these weapons. As far as dealing with the greater problem of human violence, that may take a lot longer to do, but if we get rid of the nuclear weapons, at least we'll be around to deal with that problem.
We live in a country that spends over $700 billion a year on the military, and almost twice that much as, when you include the national debt part of military spending or nuclear weapons program. So we spend almost $1.5 trillion a year, more than the next 10 countries combined. Nuclear war is just sort of the head of that. I mean, if we abolish nuclear weapons, maybe, since we're so committed to violent conflict resolution, maybe we would develop better biological capabilities. Or if a country like Iran under Saddam Hussein was afraid of American military intervention, the only thing that was going to stop us was him having nuclear weapons. And the only reason we went to war there was because we knew he didn't. I don't think we could deal with nuclear weapon capabilities or getting rid of nuclear weapons in the world until we get rid of war and this massive military, this obscene thing that we all support in this country. That has to go. We have to deal with that. You know, otherwise, you know, we might have to every 30 years try to calm down the nuclear thing, but it'll keep coming back. We have to get rid of our commitment to violent conflict resolution, which is an absurd oxymoron.
Let me say something to that. I certainly agree with the need to get rid of that whole paradigm of human relations, resolving conflict with violence. But I must tell you, I think that is going to take a very long time. And I don't think we have time to get rid of the nuclear weapons. I spent most of my career as a doctor, as an ER doctor. And occasionally patients came into the ER who had cancer. And we needed to treat their cancer. But at the moment that I saw them, they were bleeding to death. And we needed to stop the bleeding first in order to be able to save them to treat the cancer. I think we are on the brink of nuclear war. I think there is a chance, 50% chance in the next decade. We don't have the luxury of dealing with the fundamental problems of our species right now. We need to stop nuclear war now. And only if we do that will we be around to deal with the other issues. I think nuclear war is a very discrete problem in some ways. It's much easier to deal with, for example, than climate change, the other great threat to our survival, which requires a change across the entire economy. It requires all of us to change the way we live in order to be able to make this a more sustainable planet. Nuclear war is a much more discrete problem. There are 14,000 nuclear warheads in the world. They're little machines. They're not these mythic creatures from outer space. We have already dismantled more than 50,000 nuclear warheads. We know exactly how to do it. And this is a simple, doable task that we need to do. We need to stop the bleeding, and then we can deal with the underlying cancer.
I guess I just say that turning around on militarism kind of happens concurrent with that. The thinking that would create that response would also be part of, hey, you know, we don't need to spend half of the discretionary budget on the military. You know, we don't need to develop more nuclear weapons programs. They go together. You can't separate the two. If you get into, we need to be the biggest, baddest bully in the world mentality, then you need nuclear weapons. If you walk away from that, then you don't need nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't think we're really disagreeing, but I see it as a concurrent thing, you know.
Murray has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, the reason the F-35 is being based in Burlington is because Senator Patrick Leahy has made it his end of career mission to have that plane in Burlington. He pressured, in fact, he's the person who pressured the Air Force. It's not the Air Force's decision that Burlington, Vermont, an airport in a residential neighborhood would be the place for this bomb to be stationed. So that's the first thing to understand. I spoke to Senator Leahy on April 6th, which is very recent. He was speaking at Thetford Academy, and he hung around after. And I asked him about the nuclear, whether his position had changed in response to the contents of the Nuclear Posture Review, which came out in February 2018. So he claimed that was nonsense, that the mission hadn't changed, and that he wasn't
there was no nuclear mission. I've written him 3 subsequent letters, which he now has refused to answer. The other person who has consistently supported the F-35 since it was first proposed here, since Leahy first proposed it, is Senator Bernard Sanders. To date, Sanders will not answer any questions whatsoever. In any form that you try to access them, he will not respond to any questions, any comment about the nuclear. I don't know about Representative Welch, but he has consistently signed on to every assurance that Leahy, every time there was a court case, every single town meeting where citizens voted against this plane being here, Leahy wrote a letter to the Air Force and the Vermont Air National Guard saying that never mind about that. We want this plane here. Yes.
Why do they want it? What are they getting?
Their excuse.
Pardon?
Their excuse, the reason they claim,
Yeah, what is it?
I'm going to quote Sanders, hundreds of jobs. I also think I should quote Leahy on April 6th, who said thousands of jobs, and refused to respond to the follow-up question of exactly what might those jobs be. And the other people who support, somebody was concerned about whether Moreau Weinberger was supporting this. Moreau Weinberger is in lockstep with Leahy, Sanders, and Welch, as is Governor Phil Scott. So that is where Vermont's leadership at that level stands.
Even with the nuclear part?
They categorically refuse to respond, as far as my experience has been, and maybe you've gotten some other response from them, but they are refusing to acknowledge, respond to that, and they walk on this thin line. They'll say that the F-35 will not be nuclear capable when it lands here in September. That is when, I don't know whether the number is 8 or 18 planes will arrive in, the F-16s have left, the F-35 will come in September, and at that precise moment, it will not be wired. But as Jennifer said, or as in Colonel Greco's statement, is that the B-6112 bomb isn't yet ready. It's a work in progress. It's being designed to fit the F-35, even at the same time as the F-35 is being upgraded to fit the bomb. Their production date is, where they're expecting it to be available, is March 2020. So that's what we're up against if we think that to deal with the immediate concern, and that is why this resolution, both in the House and the Senate, it's vital to our futures that resolution can be passed.
Amen. We agree. Thank you
Yes.
for answering the question you raised earlier as well.
Well, I was wondering, I do know this would be a fact, so we don't have to wonder about whether it is.
This is not so much a question as a comment. We're sitting just north of a nuclear power plant that's being decommissioned. Many of the people in this room helped to shut it down. We're here in Vermont and surrounding communities, we're pretty familiar with the dangers of nuclear, anything, and the link between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. My goodness. And just, so I guess my comment is just that even though people kind of really excited when they shut that thing down, or as a way of keying into for organizing on this, there is a group of people that are for whom this is a very important issue.
I'm curious to know if people who are actively involved in that could raise their hands. And I for one would like to say thank you to all of you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, now we have Plymouth,
Oh, shut down.
Indian Point,
Can you shut it down?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, Doris, raise your
Yeah.
hand.
I just want to say thank you for educating me on the destruction of, from nuclear bombs and different things, because I wasn't aware of the things that you told us about, if New York City was attacked, different things, and that's a true eye-opener, and I hope you do speak at colleges, high school, and educate everyone, because it's quite interesting.
In the 1980s, when we did have a huge impact on policy, millions of people became politically active, literally millions, about on the nuclear weapons issue. And that activity was engendered by the fact that they understood the enormity of the danger. It's a real huge problem that we have today that people don't understand. People of my age who used to know this stuff have for the most part forgotten it. It's very unpleasant. You don't like to think about it. You like to push it out of mind. And a lot of people my age, when I speak to them, they get it. It kind of resonates with stuff they used to know, but they're not thinking about it every day like they need to. There's actually two generations of people that have grown up since the Cold War who never knew this stuff. I mean, when I go on college campuses, the level of the lack of information, let me put it this way, because I don't want to call them ignorant because it sounds like it's their fault. The level of misinformation among students is just astonishing. I teach classes occasionally about this, and people come to the class because they're interested. They have some interest in this. And I hand out a piece of paper and I ask them to write down, how many nuclear warheads do you think there are in the world? And the answers I get from smart college kids who are interested enough in this issue to come to a class usually range from 5 to 100. And there are 14,500 at the moment. And they're horrified to learn about this and to learn what these weapons can do. And I think that's an important part of our job right now, is to get this kind of information out. People need, again, to understand how bad nuclear war is going to be, because they don't. Yeah.
I think it's important to understand the history of what's brought us to this point, and the United States, like every country, has a personality, and our personality has been established by a single overarching behavior, and I'm not anti-American capitalism, but that is the overarching umbrella under which we all live. But in 1880 to 1890, the American military married American capitalism. We were 13th in the world in terms of our Navy, which was the major single military force measurable in the world, and we were 13th. And we got self-conscious about that. And between 1880 and 1890, we rebuilt our entire Navy, and by 1890, we were third, or sharing the 3 top spaces in the world. And if you look around to where those ships were, they were attendant to commercial shipping and escorting them around to different ports. And those military ships were sitting offshore. Intimidation, intended or not, I don't know, but that's what it was. And we ended up becoming third in the world, and totally linked to American capitalism.
Industrial complex here, the military industrial complex, is poised to make an awful lot of money. A lot of people on top are poised to make a lot of money from creating either, be they nuclear warheads or whatever kind of warheads or any kind of...
Jet fighters, too.
Yeah, the fighters. A lot of people are poised to make an awful lot of money. How are we going to fight that? I mean, it's just, you're coming across a tidal wave. And until capitalism is totally, the foundation is pulled out of that, it ain't going to happen.
Well, there is a lot of money involved in this. The U.S. is planning to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years. It's an astonishing amount of money. But it's not that large amount of money compared to the total economic activity of the country, and that's important for us to bear in mind. Again, the comparison with the problem we face with climate change, that's much of the economy that needs to change if we're going to have a sustainable footprint on the planet. 50 billion, we're spending about $50 billion, actually this year I think it was $63 billion on the nuclear weapons enterprise. out of a $1.5 trillion economy, which means that while there are very powerful economic forces that want this to continue, they're a very small minority of the capitalists. And most of the capital in this country, most of the economic activity of this country does not benefit from this enterprise. In fact, there are many studies that show how badly it hurts the economy for us to be spending money on this. And so I think that even before there's a fundamental change in our economy, we can get people to understand the need to be around. The people who supported the freeze in the 1980s included large numbers of Republicans who were very devoted to the economic policies of Ronald Reagan, which was, a very conservative capitalist approach. I don't think we need to have the total transformation of society or humanity in order for us to save ourselves. I think we can stop the bleeding, and I think we need to attend to that task with a great deal of focus and energy. The other broader concerns that you have both raised, I think, are terribly important. But I think we certainly can be working on those at the same time that we're working to get rid of the nuclear issue. But we don't need to wait for those transformations to take place to get rid of nuclear weapons. And we can't afford to wait for those transformations to take place. We need to identify nuclear weapons as a discrete, separate, life-threatening problem that needs to be treated promptly. And we could have all the nuclear weapons in the world eliminated by 2030. It would take about 5 or 6 years to actually dismantle them, and it would take a few years to negotiate the agreement that's necessary to bring that about. And that needs to be, I would argue, one of our 2 top national priorities, the other being undertaking the fundamental change in our energy economy so that we don't cook the planet to death.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight.
My pleasure. Do you want to talk with people a little bit about the things that in particular that you are asking people here to do?
I would,
We're going to do
yes.
that.
Yes.
Sorry, I'll get out of here right now.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I do personally believe very strongly that passing this resolution in the state legislature is going to be a tool that we can use to pressure our congressional delegation to make the right choice. I think if Ronald Reagan could have a change of heart, I think that some of our leaders could also have that, but what they will need is to hear the voice of the people, and I think that's what we represent. I want to thank all of you again for your activism in addressing the issues with the decommissioning of Vermont Yankee. I feel like that there might be some really important lessons that our campaign has to learn from your previous efforts, and I look forward to the conversations that we could have over maybe some more ice cream if anyone would like some, and also just casually as we end. But before we do that, are there any other questions? Yes?
I just wonder, since Sanders is trying to run for president, it would be something if every place he went to campaign, there was a bunch of angry Vermonters confronting him on this issue and showing him up. I don't know if that's in the works, but that would make it very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what tactics and strategies will get through to them, but I do think it's very important that Sanders and Leahy and Welch and Scott are hearing from Vermonters. I think one of the things we're working on as a campaign is when are folks hearing from us, and I think our strongest collective voice is when the resolution is passed. So we really encourage people to get behind that, and I think that will be the strategy that we'll use to press them. I think, last time Sanders ran for office, he had angry people confronting him at different times in different situations. But I don't know how much that impacted his thinking on those particular issues. But I do think that a statewide resolution could have a strong impact. Yes?
Could you say, and apologies if you said it before, but I didn't quite catch, what the status is what the status is of what's going before the legislature right now. So in other words, there's a House resolution now that that's trying to be passed. It'll then, if it passes the House, go to the Senate, or, you know, what's the process?
Right.
And then also, if it is in the House now, what the status is in terms of the support. Is there a finger on the pulse
Right.
of where it stands now? In other words, it's looking like it's about even, or it's got a fair amount of support but needs more of a surge. What's the status?
Okay, we definitely need more of a surge in the House. Right now, we have 22 co-sponsors of the House bill or House resolution, and we have just introduced it on the House floor, and we are working on seeing to it that Vermonters from all over the state are in touch with their legislators right away. Some people have been in contact already, but so for the House, that's where things stand. And unless things,
How many votes in the House?
I don't have that answer. I don't know if anyone else is more familiar.
There's like 140 or 50 numbers.
140 or 150, right. So many of them, so it's
Even though they're not co-sponsors.
right, it's going to go to committee if it gets passed. If it gets passed out of committee, which is what we're working on right now, then a lot of folks are saying they want to look at the language and make sure that it's accurate before they sign on and support it. But I think that we have some momentum, and I feel like that's one of the reasons we're doing these events around the state is to generate momentum. So if everyone who's here in this room access your own broad network of possible activists in every venue that you can, I think we can really start to make sure that legislators from all over the state are hearing this message.
So the Brattleboro legislators who have co-sponsored are Molly Burke and Emily Kornheiser. Sarah Coffey from Guilford Vernon has co-sponsored. Tristan Tolino hasn't. Nader Hashim hasn't. And Mike Morwaki has not.
As of yet, or?
As of yet.
Oh, as of yet.
They have not co-sponsored. So that's just a little from your literature, our local folks.
And I think Tristan maybe,
Tristan has not.
and Tom Stevens, the
Tristan
chair of the
hasn't.
military
Mike
affairs.
hasn't.
Right.
Hasn't.
Tom Stevens, who's in Chittenden, Washington, and so Huntington, Bolton, and Waterbury is a very important person for us to be calling at this time because he's the one who's going to be making the decision about whether this resolution passes out of committee and comes to a vote. And so if you know folks in those areas that you can outreach to, that could have a big
That's
impact.
the Military Affairs Committee, so you can write to anyone on that committee, but particularly if there's anybody in this area who's on that committee. It's the Military Affairs Committee, and Tom Stevens is the chair of that committee. We can write, even if he's not our representative,
Right.
you can write to him.
Yeah.
That's where it is at the moment. And so,
There's not much time left in this session.
right, and they're going to probably try to get it to die in committee, so
Yeah.
that's the idea.
That's what we're here to stop them from doing.
No, I mean,
Right.
there's-
Tom Stevens is the person to.
Several of us here worked a lot on legislative stuff relative to Vermont Yankee for several years. So we have a pretty good understanding of that. And from where we're at in the legislative session and where grassroots knowledge of this issue is at, it seems to me that what we need to be organizing for is next year and doing things now, you know, maybe even town meeting resolutions all over the state, that sort of thing. I mean, maybe for some reason it'll go through really quick this year, but I mean, if it hasn't even passed over from one house to the other, and we've got just a few weeks left in this session, I mean, you know, but there's a lot of work to do, so, yeah.
Yes, we do know some folks who are doing town hall level resolutions and who have tried to do that this year and are planning on doing that for the coming year. And so we do encourage people also to do that, as well as to not allow them to just ignore this issue this year. We'd like to see a groundswell.
Is there a coordinating committee for this organization?
Well, one question I would have would be if there's energy here that we'd like to harness in terms of people continuing to coalesce and work together specifically on this issue. Do people want to try to form something like that now?
Well, what I would be interested in is doing that, but plugging into what's going on a statewide basis so it's coordinated. I mean, Vermont is really unique in that it's a small state, and it sort of affords us the ability to work with other people really well. And we did that with Vermont Yankee. We had a statewide thing going on. Personally, that would help me sort of figure out what to do on the local level and how to help with things statewide.
Right. Okay, so some of the things that we're asking people to do locally is to outreach in your own network, whether using social media, email, word of mouth, tabling at a farmer's market, or whatever outlet works for you. Another thing is, if you haven't signed the resolution to be a citizen co-sponsor, to sign it, and that will offer you more tools in that regard. And then to broadcast the campaign in order to bring that grassroots attention. And I think to do some of the things in terms of resolutions at the city and local level, if that is something that would interest you. And right now, this is a new organization. We're forming from the ground up with interested volunteers getting involved and helping to drive the direction and energy of things. We are planning we're hoping to host a 24-hour meditation sit, which is tentatively planned for the State House lawn in Montpelier. Most people can't sit still for 24 hours, but we know some committed people who are planning to take a seat for peace for the full 24 hours, and we're planning to bring together everybody else who's interested in that as a witness for peace to sit with them for the last full hour of the 24 hours to bolster their spirits, and then we'll be having a press conference at that time. So there are some efforts afoot in terms of things that people are organizing locally or in different parts of the state, and if there's other types of efforts that would interest you, please reach out to us and we'll see what we can do to support the work that you would like to do. Any other questions before we end? I would just like to thank Dr. Ira Hefland again. I would also like to thank Ben Cohen for providing the ice cream. And remind folks to please feel free to take a copy of the resolution, a copy of your legislators you can call, and as many bumper stickers as you can pass out to friends and family. Thank you very much.